Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm working really hard to reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. It's a truly important milestone for me. Please click the subscribe button on the channel. It's just one click, but it gives me massive motivation to keep making more videos. Thank you all so much. He didn't go to her apartment for love. He went because she held the ledger. And Gabriel had a visceral distrust of loose ends. 2 days before a wedding that would fuse 2 syndicates, his notoriously punctual assistant had vanished. When he finally shouldered through the rotting wood of her front door, bracing for betrayal, the sharp, metallic tang of copper froze him in his tracks. What he found in that suffocating, blood-splattered room didn't just shatter his meticulously ordered world, it made him call off the wedding entirely. The chalk grated against the wool blend of Gabriel's trousers, a dry, irritating sound that vibrated straight through to his skin. He stood perfectly still on the velvet-draped pedestal, staring straight ahead into the gilded mirror. The reflection staring back belonged to a man who had successfully scrubbed his own brutality clean. The suit was charcoal, cut close to the ribs to conceal the bulk of the leather shoulder holster he refused to shed, even for fittings. "Don't breathe so heavily, Gabriel," Sloane murmured from the plush leather sofa behind him, her gaze locked on her phone. Her thumbs tapped a rhythmic tattoo against the glass screen, firing off demands to people whose names she wouldn't bother to recall. "Bianchi needs the break over the shoe to be perfect. You're shifting." Gabriel didn't reply. He rolled his jaw, feeling the familiar, dull ache of a tension headache blooming at the base of his skull. The air in the boutique hung thick with the scent of lavender oil and stale money. It was suffocating. "The hydrangeas," Sloane said, finally looking up. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek knot. She was beautiful, in the way a freshly forged blade was beautiful, sharp, cold, and utterly unyielding. "My mother thinks they look too ferial. I told her we are merging the Kensington distribution lines with the Romano ports. We aren't throwing a carnival. White, silver, black. That's the palette." "Whatever you want, Sloane," Gabriel said, his voice flat. It was a transaction, a contract sealed in imported silk and 300 guests. He didn't love her. She didn't love him. They understood each other perfectly, which was precisely why the arrangement was meant to work. But as Bianchi pinned the cuff, driving a silver needle through the fabric with a practiced flick of his wrist, Gabriel's focus drifted. He looked at the empty space beside the changing screen. Norah wasn't there. Norah Quinn had been his assistant for 4 years. She was the buffer between his violent, chaotic reality and the sterile corporate facade he maintained. She knew how he took his coffee, black, burning hot. She knew precisely how much cash to slip to the beat cops in the harbor district to keep them looking the other way. She was a ghost in the machine, a woman of unremarkable height, practical shoes, and an unnerving lack of intimidation. When the Kensington enforcers had crowded his office last month, posturing and throwing their weight around, Norah had simply walked through the middle of them, carrying a stack of files, and politely asked a man twice her size to move his foot so she could vacuum the rug. She was always there, until 48 hours ago. Gabriel stepped off the pedestal. "Senor Romano," Bianchi protested, his hands fluttering. "The jacket." "We're done," Gabriel said, shrugging off the unfinished coat and tossing it over a velvet chair. Sloane finally put her phone down, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in a sharp line of irritation. "Gabriel, what are you doing? The wedding is in 2 days. The photographer needs the final." "I have a leak," Gabriel interrupted, pulling his dark dress shirt from the rack and shrugging it on. He buttoned it with quick, impatient fingers. "Norah hasn't checked in for 2 days. Sloane let out a short, elegant sigh, crossing her long legs. "Your secretary," Fire her. Hire someone who understands the stakes of this week. She's probably just hungover or looking for a raise. Let HR handle it. Gabriel stopped buttoning his cuffs. He looked at Sloane. Really looked at her. Her skin was flawless. Her nails manicured. Her life entirely insulated from the blood that paid for the ring on her left hand. She's not a secretary, Gabriel said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the dangerous, quiet rasp that made grown men empty their bladders. She holds the encryption keys to the offshore accounts. She has the physical ledger for the dock payoffs. If she's gone, she's either selling me out or she's dead. And you think dealing with a rogue employee is a priority right now? Sloane stood up, smoothing down her skirt. My father is flying in from Boston tonight. We have the rehearsal dinner. Send one of your thugs to find her. Gabriel strapped the leather holster across his chest, the heavy, comforting weight of the Glock pressed against his ribs. I don't send people to handle my liabilities, Sloane. I handle them myself. He walked out of the boutique before she could reply. The little brass bell above the door chimed a cheerful, mocking goodbye. The air outside was thick with the threat of rain. The sky above the city was a bruised, ugly purple. Gabriel pulled his coat collar up against the chill and walked briskly to the idling black SUV parked illegally on the curb. His driver, Liam, flicked his cigarette into the gutter and scrambled into the driver's seat. Where to, boss? Liam asked, eyeing Gabriel's grim expression in the rearview mirror. South Side? Garrison Street, the apartment building at the dead end, Gabriel said, staring out the window as the first heavy drops of rain began to smear the glass. Liam hesitated, his hands tightening on the wheel. Garrison, boss? That's Kensington territory. We're not supposed to have boots on the ground there until the ink is dry on the marriage certificate. Drive the car, Liam. The SUV pulled into traffic. Gabriel leaned back against the leather headrest, closing his eyes. The irritation in his chest was slowly morphing into something else, something cold and ugly. He paid Norah a salary that should have secured her a high-rise downtown with a doorman and secure parking. When he had demanded her home address from his head of security an hour ago, he had stared at the text message in disbelief. Garrison Street was a decaying artery of the city, choked with condemned buildings and desperate people. It was the kind of place where streetlights were shot out for privacy, and the police only came to collect bodies. Why was she living there? What kind of game was she playing? He thought back to the last time he saw her. Tuesday evening, the office was empty. She was standing by the shredder, feeding documents into the machine. She had looked tired. Her skin, usually a pale, healthy cream, had been sallow. He had noticed a bruise on her jawline, partially covered by poorly matched concealer. When he asked her about it, she had offered a dry, flat smile and blamed an open cabinet door. He had accepted the lie because it was convenient, because he had a wedding to plan. Gabriel opened his eyes, feeling a sudden, sharp twist of self-disgust. He had ignored the warning signs. If she had taken the ledger to the Kensingtons to derail the merger, he would have to kill her. The thought sat heavy in his stomach, a leaden weight that tasted like ash. He didn't want to kill Norah. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to demand why she had disrupted his perfectly ordered life. The city shifted around them as they drove. The glass and steel towers of the financial district gave way to the crumbling brick and rusted iron of the industrial sector. The rain fell harder now, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof of the SUV. The streets narrowed, littered with overflowing dumpsters and broken glass that crunched beneath the heavy tires. "Pull over here," Gabriel ordered, as they approached a row of 4-story brick buildings that looked like they were slouching against one another for support. "I should come with you," Liam offered, putting the car in park and reaching for the door handle. "Stay with the car. Keep the engine running." Gabriel stepped out into the rain. The cold water immediately soaked through the shoulders of his coat. He didn't run. He walked with deliberate, heavy steps toward the entrance of the building. There was no buzzer. The glass in the front door had been smashed out and temporarily patched with a sheet of warped plywood. He pushed the door open. The hinges screamed in protest. The stench hit him the second he crossed the threshold. It was a suffocating cocktail of boiled cabbage, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp chemical tang of bleach, trying and failing to mask the scent of cat urine. The hallway was narrow. The walls painted a sickly institutional green that was peeling away in long, dry strips. A single fluorescent tube flickered on the ceiling, buzzing like an angry hornet. Gabriel's hand instinctively brushed against the lapel of his coat, feeling the hard outline of his gun. He moved silently up the stairs. The wooden steps groaned in protest under his weight. He passed the second floor, then the third. The sounds of life bled through the thin walls. A baby crying relentlessly. The muffled, tinny dialogue of a game show on a cheap television. An argument in a language he didn't recognize. It was a world of survival, raw and unpolished. The exact opposite of the world he had just left. The exact opposite of Sloane. He reached the fourth floor, apartment 4B. The door was heavy, solid oak, that looked out of place in the dilapidated building, though the wood was deeply scratched near the lock. Gabriel reached out, turning the brass knob. It didn't catch. The latch was completely broken. The metal casing splintered. He pushed the door open, drawing his weapon in one fluid, practiced motion. He stepped inside, sweeping the room with the barrel of the gun. The apartment was freezing. It was colder inside than it was out in the rain. There was no heat. Gabriel stood in the entryway, blinking against the gloom. The shades were pulled down over the single window, casting the room in a heavy gray twilight. He lowered the gun slightly, his brow furrowing. There was no furniture, none. The living room was an empty expanse of scuffed hardwood floor. No couch, no television, no rugs. The only object in the room was a cheap folding table, pushed against the far wall. On it sat a bulky, outdated laptop, a stack of heavily encrypted external hard drives, and a neat, meticulously organized row of manila folders. His folders, the syndicate's business. Where was her life? Where was the money? "I paid you, Norah," he called out. His voice sounded too loud in the hollow space, harsh and intrusive. No answer, only the sound of the rain lashing against the glass. Gabriel moved further into the apartment. He checked the tiny galley kitchen. The refrigerator was unplugged, the door hanging open to reveal empty wire shelves. The sink was dry. He turned down the short hallway toward the bedroom and the bathroom. That's when he saw it. Smears of dark, rusty brown on the linoleum floor. Not splatters, drags. The dragging marks of someone who couldn't lift their own weight. The metallic scent of copper, sharp and heavy, cut through the damp cold of the apartment. Gabriel's pulse kicked against his throat. He followed the trail. It led to the half-open bathroom door. He pushed the door wide. The hinges didn't creak. Norah was sitting on the floor, wedged in the narrow space between the chipped porcelain bathtub and the toilet. She was illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from a wire above the sink. She wasn't dead, but she looked like she was trying to be. She was wearing an oversized gray t-shirt, completely soaked through, with sweat and dark, blossoming stains of blood. Her bare legs were splayed out in front of her. A thick, bloody towel was wadded up and pressed hard against her left thigh. Her head lolled to the side against the bathtub. Her skin was the color of old parchment, gray, translucent, stretched tight over the bones of her face. The bruise he'd seen on Tuesday was now a massive, ugly sprawl of purple and yellow, covering half her face. Her lower lip was split. She wasn't holding a phone. She wasn't holding his ledger to sell to the Kensingtons. She was holding a curved needle, threaded with thick black nylon. Her hands were shaking so violently, she couldn't find the grip to push it through her own skin. Gabriel froze. For a man who had built an empire on violence, who had watched men die without his heart rate spiking, the sight of his quiet, unassuming assistant trying to stitch up her own bullet wound in a freezing, empty bathroom felt like a physical blow to the sternum. He dropped his gun on the edge of the sink. It landed with a heavy clack. Norah's head snapped up. Her eyes, usually sharp and observant, were glassy and unfocused with fever. She stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just let out a dry, rattling breath and dropped her head back against the tub. "You're tracking mud on the floor, boss," she rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. Gabriel fell to his knees beside her. The cold seeping through his expensive trousers didn't register. He reached out, his large hands hovering over her for a second, before he gripped her wrist, gently but firmly, prying the needle from her trembling fingers. "What happened?" he demanded. His voice was too harsh, too loud, cracking the fragile silence of the room. He didn't want to sound angry, but the panic rising in his chest had nowhere else to go. "Who did this?" "Don't yell at me," Norah whispered, closing her eyes. "I have a headache." "Norah, look at me." Gabriel grabbed her chin, tilting her face up. Her skin was burning hot. The fever was raging. "Who shot you?" She let out a weak, humorless laugh that ended in a cough. "Nobody shot me, Gabriel. Do I look careless? It was a knife. A very big, very ugly knife." Gabriel pulled the wadded towel away from her thigh. The wound was deep, jagged. Someone had dragged a blade across the muscle, trying to hamstring her. It was weeping sluggishly, the edges inflamed and angry red. Infection had already set in. "Why didn't you call the syndicate doctor?" Gabriel snarled, grabbing a relatively clean section of the towel and pressing it back against the wound. Norah flinched, a sharp hiss escaping her lips. "Why didn't you call me? The doctor works for your uncle." "And your uncle works for the Kensingtons?" Gabriel went perfectly still. The blood rushing in his ears sounded like the ocean. "What did you say?" Norah opened her eyes. The fever was there, but the sharp, cynical intelligence that made her indispensable cut straight through the haze. She looked at him with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "The merger is a hostile takeover. Gabriel Sloane's family isn't joining you. They're absorbing you. The hit was supposed to happen at the rehearsal dinner tonight. Poison, clean. They blame a rival family. Sloane plays the grieving widow, and her father takes the docks." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking. "I found the digital trail on Tuesday. Your uncle routed the payoff money to the caterers. I went to intercept the courier carrying the physical proof. The courier was a Kensington enforcer. He was faster than I thought." She gestured weakly to her leg, then to her bruised face. "But I got the proof. It's on the hard drive, on the table." Gabriel stared at her. The silence in the bathroom stretched out, heavy and suffocating. He thought of Sloane sitting in the boutique, complaining about the color of the flowers while she planned his funeral. He thought of his uncle, kissing him on the cheek at Christmas. And then he looked at Norah, living in a freezing box, bleeding out on cheap linoleum, protecting him. "Why?" Gabriel asked. The word was stripped of all authority. It was just a raw, desperate question from a man who suddenly realized he was standing on quicksand. "Why didn't you bring this to me immediately? Why are you living like this?" Norah let her head roll toward him. A cynical, tired smile ghosted across her split lip. "Because you were picking out suits, Gabriel. You wanted this merger so badly, you stopped looking at the shadows. If I brought it to you without ironclad proof, You would have thought I was trying to sabotage the wedding." She looked away, staring at the peeling paint on the opposite wall. "And I live like this because my mother's medical care costs $8,000 a month. The facility is nice. They have gardens." Gabriel felt a knot form in his throat, tight and hard. He paid her enough to afford the care and a life for herself, but she was sinking every penny into keeping her mother comfortable, choosing to live in squalor so he wouldn't know she was vulnerable. She didn't want him to think she was a liability. "Hold still," Gabriel commanded, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble. Gabriel didn't ask permission. He shoved his $3,000 bespoke suit jacket aside, rolled up his sleeves, and opened the small, pathetic first aid kit sitting on the toilet seat. He found a bottle of rubbing alcohol. "This is going to burn," he warned. "Just do it," Norah gritted out, grabbing the rim of the bathtub with both hands. He poured the alcohol directly over the jagged slice in her thigh. Norah's back arched, a strangled, guttural sound tearing from her throat. She bit down on her own shoulder to keep from screaming, her body trembling violently under his hands. Gabriel's jaw locked. He felt every tremor passing through her. He threaded the needle with steady, mechanical precision. He had sewn up his own men before, in basements and back alleys. But this felt different. Every puncture of the needle through her pale skin felt like an indictment of his own blindness. "You're heavy-handed," Norah gasped, her forehead slick with sweat. "You should have let the courier go," Gabriel said, his voice hard, focusing entirely on pulling the nylon thread tight. "You are an administrator, Norah, not muscle. I protect my desk." "And you sit behind it," she snapped back, though it lacked heat. "You could have died." "I'm not dead yet. Stop nagging." He tied off the stitch, snipping the thread with a pair of tiny, rusted scissors. He grabbed a roll of gauze and began wrapping her leg, pulling it tight enough to stem the bleeding, but gentle enough not to cause more pain. As he worked, he noticed the other marks on her, a faint silver scar on her collarbone, a burn mark on her wrist he had never seen, because she always wore long sleeves. She was a map of quiet, unacknowledged violence. She took the hits meant for his empire, swallowed the pain, and handed him his morning coffee with a blank face. He finished the knot on the bandage. He stayed on his knees, his hands resting lightly on her shins. His dark shirt was ruined, stained with patches of her blood. He smelled like cheap alcohol and sweat. From the empty living room, a sharp, intrusive sound shattered the quiet. Brr. Gabriel's burner phone. The one only 3 people had the number to. He didn't move. He just looked at Norah. She looked back at him, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. "Answer it," she whispered. "It's her. It's almost noon. She'll be asking about the seating arrangements." Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out the phone. The screen glared brightly in the dim bathroom, displaying Sloane's name. He hit accept, putting the phone to his ear, but keeping his eyes locked on Norah. "Where are you?" Sloane's voice was tiny, sharp, and impatient. "Liam said you went to the south side. Gabriel, the caterer is threatening to walk if we don't finalize the truffle risotto versus the wild mushroom." Gabriel stared at the blood on his hands. It was sticky, drying into the creases of his knuckles. He thought of his uncle. He thought of the poison. "Sloane," Gabriel said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice he used right before a room caught fire. "What? And don't use that tone with me. I am trying to hold this event together while you chase a runaway secretary." "Listen to me carefully," Gabriel said, watching Norah's heavy eyelids flutter as the fever pulled at her. "There is no risotto. There is no rehearsal dinner. The wedding is cancelled." Silence on the other end of the line. A long, stretching void. "Excuse me," Sloane finally hissed, the facade cracking. "You cannot cancel this wedding, Gabriel. Do you understand what my father will do? This is a merger. It's a hostile takeover," Gabriel corrected softly. "And your father is going to find out very shortly that the Romano ports are closed to him. Tell him the courier he sent on Tuesday was sloppy. Tell him my secretary sends her regards. Gabriel, do not call this number again. If I see your uncle or your father in my city by nightfall, I will sink them in the harbor." He didn't wait for her response. He crushed the phone in his hand, feeling the cheap plastic screen spiderweb and crack under his grip before tossing it into the dry bathtub. He turned his attention back to Norah. She was smiling. It was a terrible, bloody, exhausted smile, but it was genuine. "You ruined the suit," she murmured, her eyes finally sliding shut. "I hated the suit," Gabriel said. He didn't hesitate this time. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, ignoring her weak groan of protest. He lifted her off the cold linoleum. She weighed nothing. It enraged him all over again. How little space she took up. How easily she carried the weight of his world while starving herself of her own. "Where are we going?" she mumbled, her head falling against his chest. "To my house," Gabriel said, carrying her out of the bathroom, past the empty, freezing living room, and out the splintered wooden door. "To my doctor. And then, Norah, you are going to tell me exactly how we are going to tear the Kensington syndicate down to the studs." She didn't answer. She had finally passed out against his shoulder, her blood soaking into the ruined silk of his shirt. Gabriel walked down the dark, smelling stairwell, his boots kicking aside broken glass. He was walking away from his wedding. He was walking into a war, and for the first time in months, as he held the woman who had bled to keep him breathing, Gabriel felt entirely awake. The ride to the estate was a masterclass in suffocating silence. The black SUV tore through the slick, rainbow-battered streets, taking corners with a reckless speed that threw Norah's unconscious body against Gabriel's chest. He didn't adjust her. He just clamped his arm tighter around her shoulders. His jaw locked so hard his molars ground together. The heavy iron gates of his compound parted, and Liam slammed the brakes outside the front portico before the vehicle had even fully stopped. "Get Victor!" Gabriel snapped, kicking his door open. "I want him in the East Wing guest room 3 minutes ago." Liam didn't waste time nodding. He sprinted toward the security annex. Gabriel carried Norah through the cavernous foyer of his home. His boots left dark, muddy prints across the imported marble, but the pristine, curated perfection of the house only made him nauseous. The air smelled of beeswax and expensive air filters. It felt sterile, dead. He hauled her up the sweeping staircase, her head lolling against his ruined shirt, the metallic stench of her blood clashing violently with the faint scent of lemon polish. He kicked open the door to the East Wing guest suite. He deposited her onto the center of the sprawling king-sized bed. The stark white duvet instantly began to absorb the dark red fluid, seeping from her hastily bandaged thigh. Victor, the syndicate's private physician, arrived breathless 2 minutes later. He carried a heavy leather medical bag and smelled faintly of expensive gin and mints. "Gabriel, what?" Victor started, stopping dead at the foot of the bed. He took in the blood, the dirt, the bruised and emaciated woman lying on the Egyptian cotton. "Is that Miss Quinn?" "Fix her," Gabriel ordered. He backed away from the bed, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The adrenaline was receding, leaving a cold, jagged hollow in his chest. Victor didn't ask more questions. He stripped off his jacket, snapped on a pair of latex gloves, and went to work. Gabriel stood by the tall, arched window, listening to the rain hammer against the glass. He refused to look away, forcing himself to watch as Victor cut away the blood-soaked gray t-shirt and the crude bandages. "Her core temperature is 103, Victor muttered, hooking a bag of clear fluid to an IV pole he dragged from the closet. He expertly found a vein in the crook of her elbow. Dehydration. Severe exhaustion. The wound is nasty, Gabriel. Whoever did this twisted the blade before they pulled it out. You did a decent job stopping the bleed, but the infection is already racing through her bloodstream." Gabriel crossed his arms. The damp, clinging silk of his shirt felt like a second skin. "Will she keep the leg?" "Yes, provided her heart doesn't give out from the fever first." Victor began flushing the wound with a harsh, chemical-smelling antiseptic. Norah didn't twitch. She was completely under Gabriel. "When was the last time she ate? Her ribs are bruising her skin from the inside out. Her immune system is completely depleted. It's like she's been running on fumes and black coffee for a year." The words felt like a physical strike. Gabriel looked at Norah's collarbones, sharp and protruding beneath the harsh overhead light. He thought about the catered lunches he expensed to his office, the heavy, rich meals he ate while she sat at her desk outside his door, quietly organizing his empire. He had never once asked if she had eaten. He assumed she took care of herself. He assumed his money insulated her from hardship. He had assumed wrong. "Pump her full of whatever antibiotics you have," Gabriel said, his voice flat, devoid of the tremor he felt in his hands. "If she needs a transfusion, take it from me. I'm O-negative." Victor paused, looking over his shoulder. The doctor's eyes were sharp, evaluating. Gabriel Romano did not bleed for his employees. He bled his enemies. But Victor merely nodded, turning back to his patient. "I'll stabilize her, but she needs sleep, Gabriel. Real sleep. Not passing out from blood loss." There was a heavy knock on the bedroom door. Liam stood in the frame, holding the stack of encrypted hard drives and the manila folders he had retrieved from the squalid apartment on Garrison Street. "Put them in my study," Gabriel told him. Liam hesitated, glancing at Norah's motionless form on the bed. "Boss, the phones are melting down. Sloane's father just landed at the private airstrip, and your Uncle Carlo is asking why the rehearsal dinner at the restaurant was abruptly cancelled by security. He wants a face-to-face." Gabriel looked away from the bed. The guilt, the jarring realization of his own failures, crystallized instantly into a cold, focused rage. "Tell Carlo I'll meet him," Gabriel said softly. "Tell him to come here." The study smelled of aged leather, rain, and the sharp tang of gun oil. Gabriel sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a rag in one hand and the disassembled slide of his Glock in the other. He wiped down the springs with mechanical, rhythmic precision. The encrypted hard drive sat in a neat stack next to his elbow, an impenetrable brick wall holding the secrets of his impending demise. He had tried the standard syndicate bypass codes. Nothing worked. Norah had locked them down with an algorithm he couldn't crack. Down the hall, the house was entirely silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. It was 3 a.m. He slapped the slide back onto the frame of the gun, racking it once. The sharp metallic clack echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He shoved the weapon into his shoulder holster. A soft, dragging sound caught his attention. It wasn't the heavy tread of his guards. It was a friction sound, fabric against hardwood. Gabriel stood up, his hand dropping instinctively toward his chest. He moved silently to the door of the study and pulled it open. Norah was leaning heavily against the doorframe of the guest room at the end of the hall. She was a ghost. She wore one of Gabriel's oversized black button-down shirts, which Victor had clearly found in his closet, and put on her after cleaning her up. It fell to her mid-thigh, swimming on her frail frame. Her left leg was heavily bandaged, a thick brace locking her knee straight. Her right hand gripped the aluminum pole of the IV stand, using it as a makeshift crutch. She looked absolutely wrecked. Her face was a mottled canvas of purples and sickly yellows, her hair a damp, tangled mess against her neck, but her eyes, staring down the long, shadowed hallway at him, were violently awake. "Get back in bed," Gabriel ordered. His voice was a low rumble, carrying across the polished floors. Norah didn't listen. She never really did, he realized. She just managed his demands in a way that made him think he was in control. She took a step forward, dragging her stiff leg, the wheels of the IV pole squeaking softly. Gabriel swore under his breath and closed the distance in 5 long strides. He stopped right in front of her, his hands hovering, unsure where to grab her that wouldn't cause her pain. I said, "Get back in bed, Norah. You're bleeding through the dressing." "I heard cars," she rasped. Her voice was thin, completely ruined by dehydration. "Gravel crunching. You sent Liam out. Liam is pulling the guards from the harbor and redirecting them to the perimeter of this estate. Now bed." "You can't read the drives," she said, ignoring his command entirely. She leaned her weight onto the IV pole, her knuckles white. She tilted her head back to look up at him. "You don't have the encryption key. You're flying blind, Gabriel." He stared down at her. The scent of Victor's sharp antiseptic lingered on her skin, mixed with a faint, underlying smell that was purely her, something like dry paper and rain. "I can handle my uncle and the Kensingtons without a spreadsheet." "No, you can't," Norah fired back, a spark of genuine irritation finally breaking through her exhaustion. Carlo didn't just root the caterers' money. He gave them the layout of the South Armory. He gave them the shift rotations for your personal detail. If you go to war tonight, without knowing exactly what he sold them, they will slaughter your men. Her chest heaved, the effort of speaking draining the little color she had left in her face. She swayed dangerously on her good leg. Gabriel caught her by the waist. His large hand spread flat across the soft cotton of his shirt, pulling her flush against his chest. She gasped, a short, sharp intake of breath, her hands flying up to grip his forearms. For a second, neither of them moved. The physical contact was jarring. For 4 years they had existed in a sterile professional orbit, never touching, never crossing the line of the desk. Now she was pressed against him, burning with fever, her heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She felt impossibly small, yet she was holding the entire weight of his survival in her bruised head. "Let me go," she muttered, looking down at his chest, refusing to meet his eyes. "You're going to fall." "I'm going to the study," she corrected, her voice tight with a strange, defensive panic. "I need my laptop." "You need a hospital." Gabriel shifted his grip, fully intending to pick her up again. Norah's hands tightened on his arms, her short nails digging into his skin. "Gabriel, please." The word stopped him. She never said please. She organized. She executed. She informed. She didn't beg. He finally looked at her face, really looked at the raw, unfiltered terror pooling in her dark eyes. It wasn't fear of the Kensingtons. It was fear of being useless. She had starved herself and lived in squalor to prove she could handle her burdens alone. Being helpless, being carried, it terrified her more than a bullet. He slowly released his grip on her waist, though he kept his hands close. 1 hour, Gabriel compromised, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You give me the keys, you show me the drops, and then I am sedating you myself." Norah offered a ragged, bloody smirk. "Deal." The heavy leather of Gabriel's desk chair swallowed her. He had wheeled it around to the front of the desk, refusing to let her walk the extra 5 feet behind it. He dragged a heavy wooden stool over for her injured leg, propping it up carefully. Norah didn't wait for him to finish hovering. She pulled the laptop toward her, her fingers flying across the keys. The movement was jerky, uncoordinated from the fever, and the lingering effects of whatever painkillers Victor had pumped into her IV, but her muscle memory was flawless. Gabriel stood directly behind her chair, his hands resting on the high leather back. He watched the screen boot up, watched lines of code scroll past, as she bypassed the first layer of security on the hard drive. "You're shaking," Gabriel observed quietly. "Caffeine withdrawal," Norah lied. Her teeth were chattering. Gabriel turned and walked to the small wet bar in the corner of the study. He poured a finger of aged whiskey into a crystal glass, walked back, and set it on the desk next to her trackpad. "Drink it. It'll open your blood vessels. Help with the chill." She eyed the amber liquid suspiciously, then picked it up with a trembling hand and threw it back in one gulp. She coughed violently, her face twisting as the burn hit her empty stomach, but a faint flush of color crept into her pale cheeks a moment later. "Better?" he asked. "Disgusting," she croaked, setting the glass down. "Okay, I'm in." The screen flickered, revealing a massive, heavily indexed spreadsheet. It was a digital map of Gabriel's ruin. "Filter by the last 30 days, Gabriel ordered, leaning closer. His chest brushed the back of her chair. Norah tapped the trackpad. The list truncated. "Here, Carlo initiated 7 transfers from the shell company that handles the dock tariffs. Small amounts under the radar. But look at the routing numbers. Cayman," Gabriel said, his eyes narrowing. "Sloane's father's preferred bank." "Exactly. But it's not just money, Gabriel. Look at the attached files." Norah clicked on a small paperclip icon next to a transaction dated from Tuesday morning, the day she had disappeared. A blueprint filled the screen. It was the Romano shipping warehouse on Pier 4. Red X's marked the structural weak points, the blind spots in the security cameras, and the exact location of the breaker box. That warehouse holds the smuggled munitions from the Irish. If the Kensingtons hit that, the explosion will level 3 city blocks, and the police will blame me for domestic terrorism. "They aren't hitting it to blow it up," Norah corrected, her fingers flying over the keys again. She brought up an intercepted email, heavily encrypted, but broken down into plain text. "They're hitting it to steal the munitions. Sloane's father wants your guns to arm his own men for the takeover. The hit is scheduled for 4 a.m. Gabriel looked at the clock on his desk. It was 3:15 a.m. "Carlo is leading the strike team," Norah added softly. "He sent an email to Sloane's father, confirming he has the gate codes." The silence in the study was absolute, thick as wet cement. Gabriel stared at the name on the screen. Carlo Romano, the man who had taught him how to shoot, the man who had stood at his father's funeral and sworn loyalty to the bloodline. Gabriel didn't yell. He didn't smash anything. He just inhaled slowly the scent of the rain outside, filling his lungs, and exhaled a long, cold breath. "He's going to Pier 4, Gabriel stated. It wasn't a question. "He's already there," Norah said. She slumped back against the chair, the adrenaline crash hitting her fast and hard. Her eyelids drooped. "He's waiting for the Kensington trucks to arrive." "Liam," Gabriel barked, his voice low but cutting, and the study door flew open. Liam stood there, a tactical shotgun slung across his chest. "Boss, get the men in the armory. Suppressed weapons only. No heavy explosives. We're heading to the docks, and we're doing it quietly." Gabriel stepped away from Norah's chair, his face a mask of chilling, absolute calm. "Leave 2 men on the perimeter of the house. Nobody gets in." Liam nodded grimly and vanished. Gabriel turned back to the desk. He opened the heavy bottom drawer and pulled out a sleek, compact Sig Sauer. He checked the magazine, slammed it home, and racked the slide. He set the gun on the desk, right beside Norah's empty whiskey glass. Norah stared at the black metal. "I don't know how to shoot," she said, pointing at the door. "If anyone opens it, and it isn't me, You pull the trigger until it clicks empty. Gabriel walked around the desk, standing directly in front of her. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against her fevered cheek. Her skin was still far too hot. Lock the door behind me. Do not open it. Do you understand? Norah looked up at him. The cynical, detached assistant was gone. The woman looking back at him was stripped raw, terrified, but entirely present. Gabriel, she whispered. He stopped, his hand resting on the heavy brass doorknob. Don't make me plan your funeral, she said, her voice trembling. Gabriel's lips curved into a dark, genuine smile. It didn't reach his eyes, which were already dead, focused on the violence to come. I canceled the wedding, Norah, he said softly. I'm not putting you through catering a funeral too. He stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him. He heard the heavy brass deadbolt slide into place, with a definitive thunk. Gabriel turned toward the stairs, the cold logic of the impending slaughter taking over his mind. The Kensington family thought they were orchestrating a quiet corporate merger. They had no idea they had just woken the monster. The docks at Pier 4 smelled of diesel exhaust, rotting kelp, and rusted iron. The rain had slowed to a persistent freezing drizzle, leaving the world slick and coated in a greasy sheen. Gabriel stepped out of the black SUV, his boots hitting the cracked asphalt without a sound. He didn't slam the door, he just pushed it until the latch clicked. Liam fell in beside him, carrying the suppressed tactical shotgun at a low ready. Out of the shadows of the stacked shipping containers, 6 more of Gabriel's men materialized. They were dressed in flat black, their faces obscured by the collars of their wet jackets. Nobody spoke. They had memorized the blueprints Norah had pulled. They knew the blind spots. They knew the angles. 3 trucks approaching from the south access road. Liam whispered, pressing an earpiece deeper into his ear. Heavy suspensions. They're empty, ready to load the crates. Cut the power to the halogen towers, Gabriel said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. When the trucks kill their engines, we move. No survivors on the Kensington side. I want a complete blackout. A heavy metallic clunk echoed across the yard as the main breaker was thrown. The towering yellow security lights died instantly, plunging the pier into an aggressive, suffocating darkness. The only illumination came from the sickly orange glow of the city skyline, bouncing off the low-hanging clouds. Gabriel unholstered his Sig Sauer. The metal was ice-cold against his palm. He walked forward, sliding between 2 towering stacks of red and blue shipping containers. The air grew tighter. He could hear the low, throaty hum of the Kensington box trucks rolling through the main gate, their headlights cut. They were arrogant. They thought they had the keys to the castle. They parked in a neat row in front of Warehouse 7. The heavy roll-up door of the warehouse was already open. Standing just inside the threshold, illuminated by the beam of a single tactical flashlight, was Carlo Romano. Gabriel stopped. He stood in the shadow of a rusted crane 30 feet away, watching his uncle pull a silver flask from his coat, unscrew the cap, and take a long drink. Carlo looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had just secured his retirement. 3 Kensington enforcers hopped out of the lead truck. They were big men, carrying unsuppressed assault rifles, moving with the sloppy confidence of a crew that expected no resistance. "You got the codes for the inner vault, Carlo?" the lead enforcer asked, his voice carrying over the sound of the water slapping against the wooden pylons. "Already punched in," Carlo replied, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Make it quick. Gabriel is busy looking for his missing secretary. He won't notice the armory is empty until tomorrow afternoon." Gabriel stepped out of the shadows. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just walked into the open yard, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots. Carlo saw him first. The older man's hand froze mid-air, the silver flask slipping from his grip and clattering against the concrete. The liquid spilled out, dark and smelling of cheap brandy. "Gabriel!" Carlo choked out. The 3 Kensington men spun around, raising their rifles. They never got the chance to pull the triggers. From the darkness above the shipping containers, Liam and the strike team opened fire. The suppressed weapons sounded like heavy staple guns. Thip, flip, flip. It was incredibly, brutally fast. The lead Kensington enforcer dropped instantly. A neat hole punched through his temple. The second man took 2 rounds to the chest and folded over the hood of his truck, his blood sliding down the wet grill. The third managed to get off 1 wild, deafening shot into the sky before Liam's shotgun took out his knees, sending him crashing to the pavement, where a final, quiet pistol shot ended his screaming. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in Gabriel's ears. Carlo was backed up against the corrugated metal wall of the warehouse. His hands were raised, shaking violently. His eyes darted from the bodies of the Kensington men to Gabriel, who was still walking slowly toward him. "Gabriel, wait!" Carlo pleaded. His voice cracked, the confident swagger vanishing into pure, unfiltered panic. "It's not what you think. They forced me. Sloane's father. He threatened my daughters. He said he would kill your cousins if I didn't give him the warehouse." Gabriel stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the man who had bought him his first bicycle. He looked at the man who had poured whiskey on his father's grave. "You don't have daughters, Carlo," Gabriel said quietly. "You have 2 ex-wives who hate you, and a gambling debt at the Bellagio that maxed out at $3 million on Monday." Carlo's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The lie had died in his throat. "You sold my life and the lives of my men to cover a bad streak at the baccarat table," Gabriel continued. He didn't feel angry. He felt nothing at all. It was a terrifying, hollow void in his chest. "You used a Kensington courier to hide the paper trail, but you were sloppy. My assistant found you." "A secretary?" Carlo spat, a desperate, ugly sneer twisting his face as he realized begging wouldn't work. "You're going to burn your own blood for a glorified typist." "She isn't a typist," Gabriel said. He raised the Sig Sauer, locking his elbow. "She's the woman who just ended your life." Gabriel squeezed the trigger. The gun barked twice. 2 center mass. Carlo hit the concrete, sliding down the corrugated metal wall, leaving a wide, dark smear behind him. He gasped once, a wet, rattling sound, and then his eyes glazed over, staring up at the rain. Gabriel lowered the gun. The smell of burnt gunpowder mixed with the salt water. He stood over the body for a long minute, letting the cold rain wash over his face, soaking into his hair. "Boss," Liam said quietly, stepping up beside him. "The trucks are secure. No one else is coming. Load the bodies into the back of the Kensington trucks," Gabriel ordered, turning his back on his uncle. "Drive them to the airstrip. Leave the trucks parked directly in front of Sloane's father's private jet. Leave the keys in the ignitions." Liam nodded. "And Carlo?" Gabriel paused. He looked down at the silver flask sitting in the puddle of brandy and rainwater. "Put him in the driver's seat. Let Sloane's father see exactly what happens to his investments." He walked back to his SUV. The adrenaline was leaving his system, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. He slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut, and turned the key. He didn't look back at the warehouse. He put the car in gear and drove away from the docks, the tires tearing through the flooded streets, heading back to the only person in his entire empire who had actually protected him. The drive back felt endless. Gabriel's hands gripped the leather wheel until his knuckles ached. His suit weighed heavily on his shoulders, reeking of damp wool, gunpowder, and the copper tang of blood. When he walked into the pristine, lemon-scented foyer of his estate, the luxury turned his stomach. The real world was the freezing bathroom on Garrison Street. He walked down the shadowed corridor to his study. The brass knob didn't turn. The deadbolt was thrown. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood, a tight knot forming in his throat. She had listened to him. "Norah," he said softly. A heavy wooden stool scraped across the floorboards inside. The deadbolt snicked back. The door cracked open, revealing Norah's dark, exhausted eye. The door swung wide. She was slumped against the frame, swallowed by his oversized black shirt. In her right hand, dangling toward the floor, was the Sig Sauer. Her finger rested flat outside the trigger guard, but her grip on the metal was white-knuckled. Gabriel stepped inside, kicking the door shut. He reached out, gently wrapping his large hand around the barrel of the gun, easing it from her rigid fingers. He engaged the safety and tossed it onto the sofa. "You didn't shoot me," Gabriel noted, his voice rough. "You knocked," Norah whispered, scanning his ruined shirt, the dark stains on his cuffs. "Did you? Carlo is dead. The Kensingtons leave tomorrow." Norah closed her eyes. The tension snapping in her shoulders took her balance with it. Her good leg buckled. Gabriel caught her mid-collapse, scooping her up against his chest. She didn't fight him. She just rested her bruised cheek against his damp shoulder, her breathing shallow. He carried her past the desk, ignoring the laptop screen, still displaying his uncle's ruined empire, and walked straight into his private master suite. He bypassed the guest room entirely. The room was warm, heated by a stone fireplace. He laid her gently in the center of the massive bed. "I need to wash," Gabriel said, staring at his grease and blood-stained hands. "Don't move." "Can't feel my leg anyway," she murmured. "In the ensuite." Gabriel turned the water on, scalding hot. He scrubbed away the docks, the gunpowder, and his uncle's memory, watching pink-tinged water swirl down the marble drain. He stripped off his ruined suit and shirt, toweled off, and walked back in, wearing only his dark trousers. Norah was staring at the ceiling. Gabriel sat on the edge of the mattress. Victor said, "You need sleep." "My brain won't shut off," she replied, rolling her head to look at his bare chest, the syndicate ink, the pale scars. "What happens tomorrow?" I explained the new terms of existence to Sloane's father. "Sloane was a strategic alliance," she said, her voice thin but stubborn. "If you cut the Kensingtons off, you lose 20% of your gross margin." Gabriel let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. He leaned over, bracing his hands on the mattress beside her shoulders. The fever heat still radiated off her skin. "I just dismantled a hostile takeover, executed my own blood, and carried you out of a slum. And you're quoting gross margins at me. Someone has to keep the books balanced." "I was blind without you," he corrected softly. The professional distance they had meticulously maintained for 4 years vanished. He brushed his thumb gently against her jawline. "Your mother's facility is fully funded through my private trust. The apartment on Garrison Street is done. Liam is packing your things, and then he's burning that building to the ground." Norah's lips parted. "You can't just mandate my life." "I just did." He leaned closer, smelling the sharp antiseptic on her skin. "You bled for me. You are never going back to a desk outside my door. You are staying in this room." She swallowed hard. "I'm your assistant." "No," Gabriel whispered, the desperate need in his chest settling into a cold, possessive certainty. "You're my partner, and if anyone ever looks at you sideways again, I will tear their eyes out." Norah looked at the man who had orchestrated a slaughter, looking at her as if she anchored him to the earth. She let out a long, slow breath, the pragmatic walls finally falling away. "I prefer wild mushroom over the truffle risotto. Anyway," she mumbled, her heavy eyelids sliding shut. Gabriel's chest hitched with a genuine, quiet laugh. He pulled the dark linen sheets over her shoulders. He didn't leave. He lay down on top of the covers beside her, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling. listening to her breathe. The sunlight cut through the tall windows of the master suite like a physical blade, bright and uncompromising. Gabriel was already awake. He stood by the window, wearing a fresh white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a cup of black coffee in one hand, and a newly activated burner phone in the other. It was 8 a.m. The phone vibrated against his palm. The caller ID was a Boston area code. Gabriel took a slow sip of his coffee. The bitter heat coated his tongue. He hit accept and brought the phone to his ear. Gabriel. Richard Kensington's voice boomed through the speaker. It wasn't the smooth, arrogant tone of a patriarch planning a hostile takeover. It was tight. It was the sound of a man who had just looked into the back of a box and seen his own mortality. "What have you done?" "I returned your property," Richard Gabriel said, his voice smooth, carrying no malice, only absolute authority. "I hope the flight back to Boston was comfortable. You murdered Carlo. You slaughtered my men. This is an act of war. This is an eviction notice," Gabriel corrected. He turned, looking at the bed. Norah was still asleep, her breathing deep and even. The fever finally broken during the night. The dark bruising on her face was stark against the white pillows, a violent reminder of the price she had paid. Gabriel's eyes hardened. "Listen to me very carefully, Richard. The merger is dead. Sloan is entirely free to pursue other arrangements. But if your syndicate attempts to move product through my ports, if your trucks cross the city line, or if I so much as smell one of your enforcers in my territory, I won't send the bodies back next time. I will bring them to your front door myself." "You arrogant son of a... You can't run the shipping lines without my capital. You'll bleed out in 6 months." "I have better accountants than you think," Gabriel said, his gaze fixed softly on Norah. "Do not call me again." He hung up the phone and dropped it into his pocket. From the bed, there was a soft rustle of linen. Norah shifted, wincing slightly, as the movement pulled at the stitches in her thigh. She opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh morning light. She looked around the massive, unfamiliar room, her gaze finally landing on Gabriel standing by the window. "Did you shoot the phone?" she asked, her voice raspy with sleep. Gabriel walked over to the nightstand, setting his coffee cup down. "I handled Richard." Norah slowly pushed herself up, bracing her back against the headboard. She looked down at the oversized black shirt she was wearing, then at the heavy brace on her leg. The memories of the night before, the freezing bathroom, the needle, the chaotic ride to the estate, and the intense, suffocating promise Gabriel had made her, rushed back. She looked up at him. He was watching her, with a quiet, intense focus. He wasn't the polished, unapproachable boss this morning. He was the man who had knelt in her blood. "So," Norah said, clearing her throat, trying to find her professional footing, "the Kensington network is out. We're going to have to restructure the offshore accounts by Tuesday, or the shell companies are going to flag the IRS." Gabriel leaned over, bracing his hands on the mattress on either side of her hips, effectively trapping her. The scent of soap and black coffee enveloped her. "Stop," Gabriel said softly. "I'm just saying, if we don't pivot." "Norah, look at me." She stopped talking. She met his eyes. They were dark, deep, and completely stripped of the corporate mask. "Your laptop is locked in the study," Gabriel told her. "You are not touching a spreadsheet for 2 weeks. Victor is coming back at noon to check your stitches and start you on a proper diet. You are going to rest." "I don't do well with resting," she muttered, a faint flush creeping into her pale cheeks at his proximity. "I'm going to get bored." "Then I will entertain you," Gabriel replied, his voice dropping to a low, rough register that sent a sudden shiver down her spine. "But you are not working. You are healing." Norah looked at the heavy gold watch on his wrist. then at the faint silver scars on his knuckles. She had spent 4 years organizing this man's life, anticipating his needs, cleaning up his messes. She had thought she was invisible to him. She had thought she was just a ghost in the machine. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and rested her palm flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of it beneath his crisp shirt. "You canceled a multi-million-dollar wedding for me," she said quietly, stating it not as a question, but as a terrifying fact she was finally accepting. "I canceled a business transaction," Gabriel corrected, his hand coming up to cover hers, pressing her palm tighter against his chest. "I burned down a slum for you. I executed my uncle for you. I would have burned the entire city to the ground if I hadn't found you in time." Norah stared at him, the cynical, pragmatic walls she had built around her heart cracking and falling away. There was no fairy tale here. He was a violent, dangerous man, and she was the woman who kept his ledgers. Their hands were both covered in blood, but in the cold, brutal light of the Mafia world, it was the truest form of devotion she had ever seen. "Okay," she whispered, her fingers curling slightly into his shirt. "Okay." Gabriel didn't smile. He didn't need to. He leaned down and pressed his lips softly against her forehead, lingering there, a silent, absolute vow of protection. The game was over. The desk was gone. Norah Quinn was no longer the assistant in the shadows. She was the queen of the board, and Gabriel Romano was never going to let her fall again. And that is how you execute a hostile takeover of the heart. Gabriel didn't just cancel his wedding. He burned his old life to the ground, the second he realized Norah was the one truly holding his empire together. Their shift from boss/assistant to an unstoppable, ruthless power couple is exactly the kind of gritty loyalty we love to see. If you loved this dark, intense journey and want more grounded Mafia romances where the quiet ones hold all the power, smash that like button, subscribe, and share this video. Tell me in the comments what was your favorite moment of Gabriel's revenge. See you in the next.